So after their conversation comes in between while they are discussing, they discuss about the conversation between Shukadeva Goswami and Maharaj Parikshit, and that forms the overall Canto 2 to 12. The actual Srimad Bhagavatam, which begins from Canto 2 to 12, is actually comes in a conversation between Suta Goswami and Shaunakadi rishis, and that is quoted by Vyasadeva. So that's why he presents that's how he presents the conversation of Shukadeva Goswami and Maharaj Parikshit, and the overall thing is the 12 canto Srimad Bhagavatam that we have. So the author is Vyasadeva, but he directly quotes the conversation between Suta Goswami and the sages of Naimisharanya, who speak about Shukadeva Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj. So it's like a second-hand account of what Shukadeva Goswami spoke. So that's what Srila Vyasadeva writes as Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is the next one. So after we just saw the overall structure of Srimad Bhagavatam, so Canto 1 as such is considered as an introduction to whole of Srimad Bhagavatam, because an introduction serves the purpose like the author explains generally in an introduction what is he going to discuss in the book, how this book is special, and he offers some blessings and gives invitation and sets the scene, introduces the main characters, what are they, how they belong. So if you watch a movie, in the beginning of the movie sometimes the character of a particular of the particular lead role, it is kind of given an overall outlook. Okay, what are the mannerisms of this person, what he likes, what he doesn't like, something like that. A character introduction happens in the beginning of the movie to set a tone, and then the actual story begins. So similarly here in the Canto 1, Vyasadeva, before beginning to speak Srimad Bhagavatam, introduces all the major characters that will be involved in this conversation, like Suta Goswami, like Shaunakadi Rishis, Shukadeva Goswami, Parikshit Maharaj. So all these different characters that will be coming are all introduced in this Canto 1. And then that is why it is considered an introduction. So he discusses the subject matter of the book. The very first verse he explains what is the subject matter of the book that he is going to explain in Srimad Bhagavatam. And that subject matter is nothing other than absolute truth, supreme absolute truth, Sri Krishna, from whom everything began, Janmadi Asyataha. So like that he goes into detail. We will see these verses in detail in the upcoming sessions. Today we will only see an overall introduction, overall view of the Canto. So he explains the subject matter of the book, which is the supreme absolute truth, and then he explains why this book is unique. Is there any other book that has not explained subject matter? He wrote all the Vedic literatures. Did they not speak about the supreme absolute truth? He says the uniqueness of the book is it rejects all other type of cheating religions and establish the supreme religion. And also he says this one book is sufficient for God realization. Anyone who attentively reads and learns this book, for them Krishna will be manifested in their hearts soon. So this book is sufficient for God realization. That's what he mentions. And then he says, please read this book, because he invites everyone to read, because he gives multiple reasons. He says this book is the matured fruit of the Vedic tree. If you consider all the Vedas into a tree, the fruit of that Vedic tree, the matured, ripened fruit of that Vedic tree is Srimad Bhagavatam. And also, even great liberated personalities like Shukadeva Goswami enjoy this subject matter. That means it is pure and transcendental and attractive even for liberated souls. So he begs, in that sense, invites everyone to read this book for self-realization and God realization. And then he sets the scene for the whole Bhagavatam. He introduces, okay, how this Srimad Bhagavatam was like kind of started, uh, was discussed. So that whole thing he explains. So for those who are joining now, so I'm just explaining how Canto 1 is just an introduction to overall Srimad Bhagavatam. And this particular canto, Srimad Bhagavatam, is written by Vyasadeva, but it is a he introduces a conversation between Suta Goswami and Shaunakadi rishis, who actually quote another conversation between Shukadeva Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj, which is the actual Bhagavatam Canto 2 to 12. So I'm not sure if you can go back and show that slide for those who are joining late. So this is the slide I was explaining how the actual Bhagavatam is the Shukadeva Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj conversation, which is discussed by Suta Goswami and Shaunaka Rishis, and which is explained by Vyasadeva Srimad Bhagavatam for us. And then in Srimad Bhagavatam, he explains the subject matter of the book, Canto 1, and the uniqueness of the book, and blessings and invitation. And he sets the overall scene for Srimad Bhagavatam. And that is why Canto 1 is considered an introduction. So he introduces the main characters in Canto 1. The main characters are Vyasadeva, who is the author of Srimad Bhagavatam, sages of Naimisharanya who ask all the questions, and Suta Goswami, he answers their questions. So that is, these are the main characters initially that we will see. The rest of the characters will be introduced gradually. So Vyasadeva, you could say he is the best-selling author in all of history because he is the author of Bhagavad Gita, he's the author of Bhagavatam, he's the author of all the Vedic literatures, Upanishads. So in that sense, he is the best-selling author in the universe, you could say. And he's, as an author of all Vedic literatures, he is a disciple of Narada Muni and a son of Parashara Muni. He is actually a literary incarnation of the Supreme Lord. He's a Shakti Avesh avatar. He's specifically invested with the potency to to write all the Vedic literatures for the welfare of everyone. So this is Vyasadeva. He is the author. So after him, the main characters in Srimad Bhagavatam Canto 1 is sages of Naimisharanya. These are a group of sages who were very anxious that the age of Kali is coming. So they wanted to perform 1,000-year sacrifice to invoke auspiciousness for everyone and also understand what is the main way of God realization in this upcoming age. So for that, they perform 1,000-year sacrifice. They have their speaker as Romaharshan, but he gets killed by Balaramji, and then Balaramji installs Romaharshan's son Suta Goswami as the speaker. Suta Goswami is a very special personality. He has also learned all the different scriptures like his father from various spiritual masters, but he has specifically also heard Srimad Bhagavatam from Shukadeva Goswami. And concerned about the welfare of all people in general, the sages of Naimisharanya ask different questions to Suta Goswami. And Suta Goswami, as I said, is the son of Ramaharshan. He is also called Ugra Shrava, means he was very good at hearing. So, and he spoke various Puranas to this Shaunakadi rishis, including Srimad Bhagavatam. So after introducing all these characters, like we saw what is the structure of Srimad Bhagavatam, how it is a nested loop of conversations. Vyasadeva quotes sages and Suta Goswami's conversation, and they speak about the conversation of Shukadeva Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj, which is the main subject matter of Bhagavatam, the conversation between Shukadeva Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj. So the whole Canto 1 actually sets the scene for that conversation to happen. How this conversation between Shukadeva Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj happened, what happened before that, how did the circumstances led to that conversation is what is being discussed in Canto 1. So Canto 1 has totally 19 chapters, and in these 19 chapters, we can divide the 19 chapters into three subsections. Section 1 is Vyasadeva introduces Suta Goswami and the sages of Naimisharanya conversation. They both interact. The sages ask some questions and Suta Goswami answers. Specifically, the sages of Naimisharanya ask 6 questions, and Suta Goswami answers all of them. And their question and answer happens in the chapter 1 to 3. And at the end of the chapter 3, for one of the questions, Suta Goswami says, Srimad Bhagavatam is the answer. And the sages are now anxious. We wanted to perform 1,000-year sacrifice, and Suta Goswami just so quickly answered all of our questions in just 2 chapters. Second chapter 2 and 3, he finishes all the answers. So they want to extend the conversation. So they ask, oh, you said Srimad Bhagavatam is the answer for one of our questions. Can you please explain the history of Srimad Bhagavatam? And then they also ask, can you please explain the history of Maharaj Parikshit and Shukadeva Goswami? How did they meet? So in this way, they ask 3 questions, which becomes the chapter 4 to 7 and chapter 7 to 19. The rest of the Canto 1 is this three questions that they ask. Sutta Goswami takes the rest of the Canto, approximately like 16 chapters of Canto 1, to explain the answers to these three questions. And from that question, the whole Bhagavatam is going to come. Okay, at the end of the Canto 1, Sutta Goswami will say, okay, let me explain what Shukadeva Goswami spoke to Parikshit Maharaj. So that is the rest of the whole Bhagavatam from Canto 2 to Canto 12. So at this point, does anyone have any questions? Because we will enter the individual sections. Does anyone have, in general, want to ask something about Bhagavatam or some characters or some doubts? You can ask now. Then we can actually see the individual sections. Today we will just see overview of all the chapters. From next week we'll go in a little more depth in each chapter. Does anyone have any questions? Am I audible? Is the screen visible? Is everything fine?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Since we are like, okay, so we will go ahead. The section 1 is a conversation between Sutta Goswami and the sages of Naimisharanya. And in this, there are 6 questions asked by the sages. We will see what are those 6 questions in short, and then their answers also we will see. They ask, the first question that they ask Sutta Goswami is, because they want to know, do welfare for all the people of Kali Yuga, they ask this question. What is the absolute and ultimate good for people in general? For everyone. We are sages, so we are different. But in general, for all people, whether it is sages or normal people, everyone, what is the absolute and ultimate good? And they ask, Sudha Goswami, you have read so many scriptures and you have spoken to us so many different kinds of Puranas, so many different scriptures. But we want to know what is the essence of all scriptures. People in Kali Yuga are not going to have enough time to read all these scriptures and understand the essence of all the scriptures and apply it in their lives. It's very difficult. So please explain what is the essence of all scriptures so that it is easy for us to apply it. And then they also ask, what is the reason for the Supreme Lord Krishna to appear in this material world? He is unborn. He has his own. He is happy in the spiritual world. Why does he take birth in the womb of Mother Devaki and become a son of Vasudev and come to this material world? What is the reason? And then they also ask about the origins of the material creation. How was the material creation manifested by the Supreme Lord? So in essence, they ask, what are the different incarnations or the manifestations of the Supreme Lord who actually create this material world? So tell us about Purusha avatars. And they also say, okay, after creating the world, the Supreme Lord comes himself and performs various pastimes and various incarnations. These incarnations where he comes to perform pastimes in this material world. And then he also speaks, where does Dharma take shelter after Lord Krishna's disappearance? Because they know that Lord Krishna has disappeared. They want to know how did or where did Dharma take shelter? Because now that Krishna has gone, who is the shelter of Dharma, where has Dharma taken shelter? So these are the 6 questions they ask. So these are the exact verse numbers that they ask these questions in Srimad Bhagavatam, and the exact wordings of the question: what is absolute and ultimate good for people? What is the essence of the scriptures? For what reason did the Lord take his birth from Devaki's womb? Tell us the acts of the Lord performs in relationship to creating the material world. Describe the activities of the incarnations of the Lord, and where does religious principles take shelter after Krishna's disappearance from this planet? So these 6 questions the sages ask in the first chapter. The whole first chapter is just Vyasadeva saying what is the subject matter of the book, what is the uniqueness of the book, and invitation to read the book. And then he starts. Once upon a time, there was a conversation between the sages and Sutta Goswami, and they asked these questions. So he just mentions all these questions. So 23 verses are there in first chapter, and it's all about these 6 questions. So now Sutta Goswami is tasked with answering these questions. So he, from the beginning of chapter 2, he starts to speak answers. Before speaking the answers, he glorifies, he offers his obeisances to his spiritual master, Shukadeva Goswami, and then he begins to answer these. So these are the questions when we will see the answers. The absolute and ultimate good for all people in general, Sutta Goswami says this most important words, Savai Pumsam Paro Dharmo Yato Bhakti Radokshuje Ahai Tuki Apratihata Ya Atma Suprasidati. He quotes this verse saying, the devotional service is the absolute and ultimate good for all people in general. Parodharma, it is the highest dharma which should be, which is unmotivated and uninterrupted. That bhakti done to Adokshaja, to Supreme Lord Krishna, is the absolute and ultimate good. And then he says, what is the essence of all scriptures? Essence of all scriptures, he says, is Vasudeve Bhagavati Janayati Ashwavairagya Jnanam Chayadahaitu Bhakti Yoga Prayojitaha. So he says that Bhakti Yoga Prayojitaha. So the process of devotional service, like hearing, chanting, engaging in all these activities, this process of devotional service is the essence of all scriptures. So then he quotes this famous set of verses which starts with Shraddha, Sadhu Sangha, Bhajana Kriya, Anartha Nivritis. Like that, it leads one person until Prema, the stage of love of Godhead. So this process which leads a person to the stage of love of Godhead, this process of bhakti is the essence of all scriptures. If we read scripture but we don't apply this process, then it is no use. The actual purpose of reading scriptures is to engage in the process of bhakti. That's why that is the essence. And he says reason for Krishna's appearance is to actually reclaim those in the mode of pure goodness. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyutanam adharmasya tadatmanam shrijamiham. And then he says paritranaya sadhunam. That's what is here also mentioned. Paritranaya sadhunam. To reclaim those in the mode of pure goodness. And tell us about Purusha avatars. He says, Lord Krishna manifests in the material world by expanding into Karanodakshai Vishnu, Shirodakshai Vishnu, Garbhodakshai Vishnu. By these different manifestations, actually Krishna takes care of the material creation and its maintenance. So he says, he takes few verses. I'm just putting it in a short way. We will see in the future when we see those chapters in detail. And then he speaks, they ask about Leela Avatara, so he gives a whole list of incarnations, something like 22, 23 incarnations, and then he says the incarnations of the Supreme Lord are unlimited, but they all are coming from the Supreme Lord Krishna. They are all either plenary expansions or the expansions of the plenary expansions. In this way, Lord Krishna is considered the Supreme Lord. That is also this famous verse, Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam, that is also quoted in this chapter. It is considered the Paribhasha Sitra of Srimad Bhagavatam. That is also quoted in this chapter too. And then the last question, the most interesting question, where does Dharma take shelter after Krishna's disappearance? So for this, Sutta Goswami says, Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam is the place, it is considered like a sun. Krishna is also considered like a sun. When that sun sets, then he again raises like comes out as appears as the son of Srimad Bhagavatam. So now Dharma has taken shelter of Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is an interesting answer. From this answer, the whole rest of the Srimad Bhagavatam is going to come. So now Sutta Goswami says, "Oh sages, I heard this from Shukadeva Goswami when he was reciting it to Parikshit Maharaj. I heard this same Srimad Bhagavatam from the lotus mouth of Shukadeva Goswami when he was reciting it to Maharaj Parikshit, who was about to die. So by his mercy, I know this particular scripture. So by saying that, he ends the chapter 3. So now what happens is the sages have asked 6 questions. Sutta Goswami has answered all those 6 questions. So now conversation is over. You asked me 6 questions. I answered all your 6 questions. So thank you very much. All goes to Prabhupada. Like he kind of completes the lecture. So the sages are thinking, oh my God, like we thought like it's going to be 1,000-year sacrifice. So he's just completing it so quickly. So they want to ask follow-up questions. So they want to ask some more questions to keep the conversation going. So they asked 3 questions. Specifically, Shaunak Rishi, who is the head of all the sages, he asked them these 3 questions. He asked on behalf of all the sages these three questions to Suta Goswami. The first question he asks is, "Oh, you spoke that Srimad Bhagavatam is the place where Dharma takes shelter. Can you please explain the history of that Srimad Bhagavatam? When it was written, where it was written, why and how it was written, who was the inspiration behind it? Because Vyasadeva read so many literature, why he had to write again Srimad Bhagavatam? So we heard there is a history behind it. Can you please explain that?" And he also says, "You know that we have heard about Parikshit Maharaj. He is a great king. Even his birth was very amazing and he did great activities. So why did he give up his kingdom? Why was he about to die in 7 days? Who cursed him? How does this whole thing happen? So can you please explain about his life?" And they also ask, "Oh, Shukadeva Goswami, he is considered a very renounced person. How did he meet this king? How did their meeting take place, where it took place? Can you please explain those details?" So in this way, they ask three questions in the fourth chapter. So from these three questions, the rest of the Canto 1 is going to come. These are the seed questions from which the Canto 1 will sprout. Question 1 will be answered in chapter 4, 5, 6, and partially in 7. Chapter 2 will be answered in question 2 will be answered in chapter 7. And the question 3 also will be answered. 2 and 3 combined will be answered from chapter 7 until the end of Canto, which is chapter 19. So now we finished one section overview, which is chapter 1 to 3. What happened in this section so far was the sages asked 6 questions. I'm hearing some noise. Can all others can mute their side so that this noise is not there? Prabhu, kindly mute from your side so that I'm not having this noise here. So we saw this first section, and Sutta Goswami answered all these 6 questions. So they asked follow-up questions. Now Sutta Goswami is going to answer those follow-up questions. You all know what is the first question this Shaunakadi Rishi asked. Please explain the history of Srimad Bhagavatam. So that is going to be discussed from chapter 4 to 7. So history of Srimad Bhagavatam will be discussed in chapter 4 to 7. So let's see the details. In chapter 4, what happens is Vyasadeva actually, now Vyasadeva is the author of this book, but here Vyasadeva is coming because Suta Goswami is explaining the history of Srimad Bhagavatam to the Shaunakadi rishis. So he is saying how once Vyasadeva was sitting in meditation on the banks of river Saraswati, and he sees that the age of Kali is going to come, and this age will be very degraded. People will have no or less memory. So he thinks that all the Vedic knowledge will be lost because people so far were for propagating the Vedic knowledge by hearing and speaking it to their disciples. But he understands in Kali Yuga people will not have so much memory. So he actually divides the Vedas, writes it into separate 4 different Vedas, and he gives Upanishads and the supplementary Puranas and all the Mahabharata and everything he writes, and then teaches it to different personalities, and they teach to others. So in this way, once he has done all this work, still he feels dissatisfied. And he's wondering, why am I so dissatisfied in spite of doing all these great help for all the common people? I have written down everything that has to be written. Why am I feeling so dissatisfied? And he's wondering, he's remembering his Guru Maharaj Narada Muni, so he comes there. So this appearance of Sri Narada is the chapter 4. He only Narada Muni appears at the end of the chapter. But the whole chapter discusses how Vyasadeva divides the Vedas and how he is dissatisfied. Chapter 5 is now that Narada Muni, his spiritual master, is here. So Vyasadeva explains to him that he is feeling so despondent, he is so feeling dissatisfied. So Vyasadeva requests Narada Muni, what is the reason for my dissatisfaction? So Narada Muni says, you haven't written completely about the glories of Supreme Lord Krishna. You have not glorified Supreme Lord, you have not glorified the process of devotional service exclusively in any of your books. Most of your books are focused on Karma Kanda and Jnana Kanda, but it is not so much focused on devotional service, bhakti. So please explain the process of the glories of the process of devotional service and the process of devotional service and the glories of Supreme Lord Krishna. Only then you will be satisfied, because he also notes, if after writing all this you are not feeling satisfied, how are the people who will read your books will feel satisfied? And then he quotes the importance of glorifying Lord Krishna. For that, he narrates his own previous life. He says, I am your spiritual master, but I came to this position because I engaged in devotional service. I heard the glories of Krishna. And then he quotes his previous life, how he was a son of a maid servant, and in his place, for 4 months the Bhakti Vedantas come and stay, and his mother engages in their service. So as a single son of a widowed mother, he also engages in their service, and he sits and hears all the glories of devotional service and Krishna that they are discussing in those 4 months. By hearing Krishna Katha, he becomes completely transformed, and they initiate him. And uh, and then Vasudev asks, "Oh, what did you do after they left, after Chaturmasya?" He says that my mother died. So I went to forest, I meditated on whatever they taught me, and the Supreme Lord appeared and then said, in the next life you will come to me. Until then, continue practicing that yoga. In this way, in the next life, I assumed this body of Narada that I am now. In this way, he continues the narration of his previous life, and then he says, because devotional service is so powerful, it can make one so perfect. Please explain that devotional service in your book exclusively. And then he departs, giving this instruction to Vyasadeva. This happens in chapter 6. So now in chapter 7, after getting instructions from Narad Muni, Vyasadeva sits in meditation on the river bank, Saraswati, and then he compiles Srimad Bhagavatam. And he actually meditates. In his meditation, he sees what is the degraded condition of Kali Yuga. He sees the Supreme Lord Krishna, and he sees the external energy of the Supreme Lord Maya. And then he finally gets inspiration how to compile Srimad Bhagavatam, and he compiles it. After he compiles Srimad Bhagavatam, he teaches it to his son Shukadeva Goswami. This is so important because Shukadeva Goswami was already a liberated soul. He was not interested in anything worldly. So, but he became attracted to Srimad Bhagavatam and he studied it from Vyasadeva. So that is how great Srimad Bhagavatam is. It is attractive even to liberated souls. And then now Suta Goswami has explained the history of Srimad Bhagavatam. How Vyasadeva was feeling dissatisfied, Narada Muni came, instructed him to write, and then he meditated and he wrote Srimad Bhagavatam or edited Srimad Bhagavatam. So now he has explained in 3-4 chapters how what is the history of Srimad Bhagavatam. Now he will start to describe the birth of Parikshit Maharaj, because that is the second question that the sages asked. The first question they asked is history of Srimad Bhagavatam, that he has already answered. Now he goes on to the second question, which is the birth of Parikshit Maharaj. So he starts describing that. So now we are entering the third subsection of Canto 1, which discusses about Maharaj Parikshit birth, activities, and meeting with Shukadeva Goswami. So in chapter 7, what happens is Ashwatthama at the end of Mahabharata war kills the sleeping five sons of uh, Draupadi. So then Arjuna catches Ashwatthama and then they punish Ashwatthama. So because of that, he becomes angry and he releases Brahmastra. So once he releases Brahmastra, he and then they actually he releases Brahmastra to kill Parikshit in the womb of Uttara, who is the last surviving heir of Pandavas. He even wants to kill the last surviving heir so that the Pandava dynasty will be stopped. But Krishna saves them, saves Parikshit Maharaj. So after this happens, Kunti Maharani offers prayers, because Krishna, after settling all these things, is ready to go back to Dwarka. He has been staying away from Dwarka for such a long time actually, for this Kurukshetra war and all the other things. So he has been away from Dwarka so much. So as soon as the war is over, now that all the enemies are dead, Yudhishthira Maharaj can become a king, so he wants to leave to Dwarka. So Kunti Maharani prays and then says, please don't go now. But he says, no, I have to go. He continues. But in chapter 8, at the end, uh, Yudhishthira Maharaj comes and then tells Krishna, I don't want to be the king. I'm feeling so bad because of me, because of I wanted to be the king. There's so many people are dead and so much misery has come upon everyone. So I feel so much responsible for all these misery of people and I feel so bad. And then Krishna kind of advises him, don't think it's about you. You are not the cause of all these things. Just become the king and rule the kingdom. That is my desire. But he is not able to convince Yudhishthira Maharaj. So he understands this is the time to glorify Bhishma Dev. So he takes all the Pandavas dressed nicely as kings to Bhishma Dev, who is lying in the battlefield in the bed of arrows. Bhishma Dev is actually happy to finally see all his grandsons in the kingly position, and then Yudhishthira Maharaj expresses his dissatisfaction to Bhishma Dev, and Bhishma Dev says, "Don't worry about it," and answers all his questions, convinces him to become the king, and then Bhishma Dev finally understands this is time for me to leave my body because Krishna is there. So he prays to Krishna, and then after praying to Krishna, focusing his lotus face, and then keeping him in his heart, he leaves the body. The glorious passing away of Bhishma Dev is encountered in chapter 9. You may say, now that Parikshit Maharaj has taken birth, why is Suta Goswami explain all these things? Actually, he is explaining all these things because after birth, he has to become a king. But before he becomes king, how he became king, what are the circumstances because of which Parikshit Maharaj became king? That is what is being discussed now. That means after he was saved, Yudhishthira Maharaj became king, and after Yudhishthira Maharaj leaves the kingdom, then only Parikshit Maharaj can become king. So, what makes Yudhishthira Maharaj renounce his kingdom? That is what is discussed shortly in few chapters. Now that Bhishma Dev left his body, Yudhishthira Maharaj is coronated as king and then he starts to rule. So Krishna says, everything is now well, so I am going back to Dwarka. So Suta Goswami explains how Lord Krishna departed from Hastinapur. What did the Hastinapur Vasis think about Krishna's departure? How did he travel? What is the route took from Hastinapur to Dwarka? And then how did he travel? All the details. Now the sages are wondering, we asked the question about Parikshit Maharaj. Why Suta Goswami is explaining we understand Lord Krishna is like explain it's Krishna's pastimes, but I think he got little distracted. So the sages were thinking, we think Suta Goswami got into ecstasy, and then he's now more and more speaking about Krishna. He has gone into following Krishna. Now that Krishna has left Hastinapur, he's going to Dwarka, and then he will continue to explain Krishna's history. What about Parikshit Maharaj? But they cannot immediately say because Suta Goswami is the speaker, respectable person. So they wait. So he explains Krishna's departure, he explains Krishna's travel, and then finally he arrives at Dwarka. So the sages understand, oh, this is a good junction to stop him and ask him about our actual question. So at the end of the chapter 11, when the when when the sages find that Krishna has arrived at Dwarka and he is back with his twins, they immediately take that opportunity. In the beginning of chapter 12, they ask, "Oh, our dear Suta Goswami, we actually, originally, our intent was about knowing about Parikshit Maharaj. We are very happy to hear about Krishna, but would you mind speaking more about Parikshit Maharaj?" So Suta Goswami understands, oh, I got transcendently spaced out. I got into ecstasy and then I started speaking more about Krishna. So yes, I'll speak more about Parikshit Maharaj. So he starts again speaking about Parikshit Maharaj in chapter 12. So in the chapter 12, he speaks how Krishna enters the womb of Uttara and then protects Maharaj Parikshit. And in this way, Maharaj Parikshit takes birth. And then he explains what happened after Parikshit Maharaj's birth. How did he become king? Actually, after 30, 40 years of ruling the kingdom, at one point, Vidura comes back and then takes Kunti Maharani, Dhritarashtra, and Gandhari back, and then they go back to Godhead. And then Arjuna goes to Dwarka to see Krishna because he is feeling so much separation from long time. But when he comes back, Yudhishthira understands that Krishna has left this world. So once they understand that Krishna has disappeared from this world, they also understand it is time for us to wind up. We can pass on the kingdom now that Parikshit Maharaj is of right age to become a king. We can actually retire. So they give up the responsibility to Parikshit Maharaj and they all go to forest. So from chapters 13 to 15, Suta Goswami explains the various events leading to Parikshit Maharaj becoming a king. So he told Parikshit Maharaj's birth, and then he told the events that leads to Parikshit Maharaj becoming a king. And now in chapter 16 to 17, he explains what did Parikshit Maharaj do after becoming the king? What are his activities as a king? And then he explains in chapter 16 and 17 how he ruled so nicely, and then there was no illegal activities going on in his kingdom, that even Kali was unable to enter. It was time for Kali to begin, but Kali as a person was not able to find any place in his kingdom. So then he meets how he hurts the Dharma bull and Mother Earth's cow, and then they meet that conversation, and how Maharaj Parikshit holds Kali, punishes him and keeps him under control. All these things are mentioned. But it's time factor, it has to flow, then Kali has to enter. If Kali has to enter, it cannot happen as long as Parikshit Maharaj is there. So by Krishna's will, Parikshit Maharaj once goes for a forest hunting and then goes to Samik Rishi's cottage for water. He wants to drink some water, but Samik Rishi is totally in samadhi. He didn't realize that Parikshit Maharaj is here. So Parikshit Maharaj momentarily becomes angry and then puts a dead snake as a garland. Since he didn't receive the king with a garland, he said, "I'll give you a garland." So he puts dead snake. But his son becomes very, very disturbed by this act of Parikshit Maharaj and curses him. You disrespected my father who is a Brahmin, you will die in 7 days. Parikshit Maharaj is potent to counter this curse, but he understands Krishna's will and then he says, "This is time for me to go. That is why Krishna has arranged this. I'm not going to counter this curse." So he leaves the kingdom. He says, "I only have 7 days to die, so I'll give up the kingdom." He makes his son Janamejaya as king, and then he goes to the banks of Ganges to fast for 7 days and to give up his body. This is chapter 18. But now in chapter 19, there is Suta Goswami, one more thing he has to explain. So now he explained Parikshit Maharaj's birth, how he became king, what he did after becoming king, then what made him renounce the kingdom. That also they asked a question. So he explained that. But now the final thing, the last question, how did Parikshit Maharaj and Sukadeva Goswami meet with each other? So what happens, Parikshit Maharaj, after giving up his kingdom, he goes to the bank of Ganges, and knowing that all the different sages come, and then he asks the sages, "What should I do now? I only have 7 days to live. What should I do?" So then the different sages discuss, they all suggest different things. There is no conclusion. At that point, Shukadeva Goswami comes. By Krishna's arrangement, he comes to Hastinapur, and then he comes to this place of where Parikshit Maharaj and all the sages are assembled. Seeing Shukadeva Goswami, all the sages welcome him and then tell Parikshit Maharaj he is the best person to tell you what to do at the whatever all your questions will be answered perfectly by Shukadeva Goswami. They all unanimously accept Shukadeva Goswami as the speaker fit for speaking to Parikshit Maharaj. So in this way, Parikshit Maharaj accepts Shukadeva Goswami as spiritual master and surrenders at his lotus feet and asks him, "Oh, my dear Shukadeva Goswami, by Krishna's grace, we have your presence. May I know that I am about to die? What is my duty? What is the duty of a person who is about to die? What should he hear? What should he chant? And what should he remember? Please explain these subject matters to me." There ends the first canto. First canto ends when Parikshit Maharaj asks these questions. What is the duty of a person at the moment of death, or who is about to die, which is every one of us in this world is about to die. So, what is the duty of a person who is about to die? What he should hear, chant, and remember. So, then Canto 2, Shukadeva Goswami will begin speaking. What is the subject matter that one person who is about to die should chant, hear, and remember? In this way, then the whole Srimad Bhagavatam is going to be spoken in from Canto 2 to Canto 12. So, here the Canto 1 ends, all these 19 chapters. So far we saw three subsections. The first section, Suta Goswami and Shaunakadi Rishis, they exchanged 6 questions and 6 answers. And the last question was answered as Srimad Bhagavatam. So the sages asked, "Okay, can you please explain the history of Srimad Bhagavatam? Also, Suta Goswami, can you please explain to us how did Maharaj Parikshit take birth? What are his activities? How did he meet with Shukadeva Goswami? So then Suta Goswami explains from chapter 4 to 7, history of Srimad Bhagavatam, and chapter 7 to 19, Maharaj Parikshit's birth, activities, and his meeting with Shukadeva Goswami. So in this way, the Canto 1 ends. So this is the structure of Canto 1. I wanted to explain this today so that in the coming weeks, we can see what happens in these individual chapters in a little more detail. So thank you very much. If any one of you have any questions, we can ask those at this point. Else, we can complete the session now. Anyone has any questions, we can kindly ask.
Prabhuji, this is
Yes.
Raja here.
Hare Krishna.
Right.
Thank you. Bro. Yeah, please tell me.
So in Srimad Bhagavatam,
Okay.
the Bhagavad Gita comes as a part, right?
Oh, no, I
Part
didn't
of
get you.
Bhagavad.
No,
I
Bhagavad
mean,
Gita is part of Mahabharata. Srimad Bhagavatam is a
okay.
separate scripture actually. Bhagavad Gita comes as the 28th to 42nd chapter of Bhishma Parva of Mahabharata. Mahabharata. It's part of Mahabharata.
Okay.
Srimad Bhagavatam is totally different. It is, that's why I was explaining in the beginning. It is a conversation between Suta Goswami and Shaunakadi rishis, and then they speak about Parikshit Maharaj.
Okay.
So like I was explaining this in the initial, this particular verse, how Vyasadeva is the author of the Bhagavatam, but he explains the conversation between Suta Goswami and the sages of Naimisharanya in Canto 1. And actually Suta Goswami and sages, they are discussing about the conversation that happened between Shukadeva Goswami and Maharaj Parikshit, which is actually the Bhagavatam 2 to 12. So in overall, Vyasadeva presents this conversation inside a conversation.
Okay. But it is not related to Mahabharata. Is that what you're saying? It doesn't come in Srimad Bhagavatam itself. Is that true?
But the Bhagavad Gita,
Bhagavad
you are
Gita or the
saying,
Mahabharata? I mean,
yeah, Bhagavad Gita is part of Mahabharata. Bhagavatam is a
yeah.
separate scripture. It's a separate Puran.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. I think, yeah.
Hi.
I'm just starting to understand. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, we can end today's session now. And next week we can see both Tuesday and Wednesdays, chapter 1 to 3. We can see as much as possible. We have in the remaining 5 weeks, we will see from chapter 1 to 19 in detail what is happening in those chapters. Today was just an overview of the whole canto. And from next week, we will see what happens in chapter 1, what happens in chapter 2 with a little more detail. Okay.
Yeah, Hare Krishna Prabhuji.
Yes,
Are
Hare
you
Krishna.
also recording these sessions?
I recorded this session. I recorded my audio. I'm recording this overall presentation also. So I'll be forwarding the presentation today.
Yeah, Prabhuji is very useful. Like, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your wonderful lecture.
So from next week, we will see the chapters in detail. So you all, what you can do until next Wednesday or Tuesday, whenever you are hearing, you can just kind of at least have Bhagavatam in hand. In chapter 1 and 2, we can, most probably 1 and 2, we will take next week. If you have the book, you kind of go through or something, at least you have the book with you. Next week, it will be useful. So this whole session is to inspire for you to personally read Bhagavatam, because it's very difficult to go in detail of every verse together. That takes a lot of time. At least I'm giving you an overview so that you can start to read and understand like, okay, how is it flowing? What is happening here? Okay. Thank you all very much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful that you all joined, took your time and joined today. Hope to see you in the coming weeks. Thank you very much. Let's, like, if you don't have questions, you can gradually leave the meeting. Then I'll know I can end it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Hare
Prabhuji.
Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Right.